Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm your lecturer Tahir Ali Khan of KUST Hangu campus.
In this lecture, I would like to offer a few historical contexts for thinking about Shakespearean tragedy. I shall first offer some background about the performance conditions and attitudes towards theatrical performance in the late 16th and early 17th century England when Shakespeare wrote his plays. I shall then go on to discuss some of the tragedies that were being written for the Elizabethan stage a little before Shakespeare's composition of Hamlet. And finally, I shall offer some remarks on the reign of King James I, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, the period in which all but one of Shakespeare's major tragedies were written. I shall suggest how the playwright's work might speak to the preoccupations and anxieties of his own historical moment. Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616. His plays were written roughly between 1590 and 1613. He writes at the very beginning of the invention of the English theatre as we know it. That is when plays are first being written in large numbers as secular and commercial entertainment. In 1576, James Burbage builds the first permanent theatre building in England. The 1580s and 1590s saw the construction of several more. In 1598, the Globe Theatre was built and eventually became the permanent home of Shakespeare's company. All the theatres were built outside what were then the official administrative boundaries of the City of London. This was not a high-class area. It was full of the kind of places that wanted to be beyond the limits of the city ordinances. The brothels and the pits for bear and bull baiting and cockfights, all the kinds of places that annoyed the good, solid merchants because they drew their apprentices and work people away from the business of the day. Theatres were from the start a cause of controversy and contention. They were places where the divisions of a society which was much more hierarchical than ours were put in question. Nobles, tradespeople, and the roughest laborers rubbed shoulders in the audience. Play acting itself challenged notions of hierarchy. Players, actors didn't fit in with the class people, but were in fact dangerously adept at impersonating all kinds of people. These people, these actors, these people of dubious status could imitate kings and lords and generals, and they thus, by their very actions, challenged the notion that nobility or courage was something inherent or inherited and mainly or indeed only to be associated with high birth. These people could perform nobility. The stage was also a place where gender distinctions became blurred. In England, until the late 17th century, there were no professional actresses. Young boys played all the women's roles. All of these things provoked several writers to denounce the whole phenomenon of the popular theatre. What we now think of as high art was seen by a fair number of Shakespeare's contemporaries as a source of social and moral corruption. Philip Stubbs, a radical Protestant critic of the stage, wrote a lengthy treatise called The Anatomy of Abuses in 1583. In it, he denounces the theatres and all those who acted in them. Stubbs is particularly paranoid about men playing women's parts. He writes, "Our apparel was given us as a sign distinctive to discern between sex, and therefore one to wear the apparel of another sex is to participate with the same and to adulterate the verities of his own kind. Men playing women," he argues, "might as well be called hermaphrodites, monsters of both kinds, half women, half men." Originally, theatres were more like amphitheatres. They were open to the sky and had no artificial lighting. Plays were performed in the afternoons. A stage thrust out into the middle of the theatre building, which was usually polygonal in shape. The audience either stood in the pit in front of and around the stage, or if they paid more, could sit in the galleries on the sides of the building. Later we get the private indoor theatres. These are much more expensive to attend. A particular famous one of these was the Blackfriars Theatre, which would eventually be used by Shakespeare's own company, the Kingsmen. One important thing to bear in mind is that a person doesn't have to be literate in order to be able to understand and enjoy the action of a play. So it isn't just the educated people who were found at the open-air theatres. The theatre companies played every day except the major church holidays. Well, they couldn't play in bad weather, of course, and the theatres were closed during times of plague epidemic for fear that people massed together would help spread contagion, and plague epidemics are a reality at this time. There were violent outbreaks of bubonic plague in 1592, 1594 and 1603, which closed the theatres. The companies had very large repertories. Plays were learned, rehearsed and performed in swift succession, and 10 days would be a very long run for a new play. London at this time had a population of about 200,000 people, and surviving records from the Globe Theatre indicate that the theatre was able to hold about 3,000 people, and people went to the theatre a lot, so a fast turnover of plays was needed. We know again from surviving records that in the season of 1594 to 1595, the company known as the Lord Admiral's Men performed 38 plays, 21 of them newly written, which means a new play would have been aided every 2 weeks or so. Plays weren't thought to belong to high culture, to literature at all. Many hundreds of them were churned out between the 1580s and 1642. After 1642, the theatres were closed for almost 2 decades as a result of the more puritanical parliamentarians coming to power in the English Civil War. To be a playwright was not an elevated profession. It wasn't initially perceived as being an artist. Indeed, when the poet Ben Jonson, who also wrote plays, published his complete works in the early 17th century, many of his readers were amazed that he included his plays among them, as if they were the same kind of artistic objects as his lyric poetry. Shakespeare's work, which we tend to owe so respectfully as monumentally high culture with capital letters, was originally part of the popular culture of his time, entertainment for ordinary, even subliterate folks. As I mentioned in my previous lecture, Shakespeare writes his major tragedies between 1600 and 1608. But let's first look at some of the tragedies produced by other playwrights between 1558, when Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne, and the writing of Hamlet in 1601, the forerunners, as it were, of Shakespearean tragedy. In 1562, Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton wrote Gorboduc. This play was written before even the first permanent theatre was built by Burbage, but we do have evidence that it was performed at court before Queen Elizabeth. We can see in it certain features that we take for granted in Shakespearean drama, but which were new at the time. It has a 5-act structure, a design which is derived from the classical Latin plays of Roman author Seneca, who was much admired by Shakespeare's contemporaries, but it is written in blank verse, that is, in the unrhymed verse lines in the particular rhythm we call iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is a fancy way of saying that the line consists of 5 groups of 2 syllables in which the poetic stress is put on the second syllable. The sound is basically da-dum, 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 da-dum. Thou knowest the mask of night is on my face, says Juliet to Romeo in perfect iambic pentameter. Now, it would be really boring if every single line in a verse drama had the precise rhythm. It functions as a kind of template on which rhythmical variations are made. At any rate, this is the verse form in which Shakespeare writes the greater part of his tragedies. Sackville and Norton's play Gorboduc is a political tragedy set in ancient Britain. It concerns the unhappy results of King Gorboduc's ignoring his counselors' advice and deciding to divide his kingdom between his 2 sons, an act which results in his own death and also in the murder of one brother by the other, civil war, and a whole-scale rebellion of the nobility. It sounds pretty exciting, but it is not, since all the physical action occurs off stage and is reported by messengers, and the play is written in really boring verse. However, it does create a precedent in English drama for the writing of political tragedy, and it shows that Elizabethan playwrights were interested from the very start in such questions as the proper actions of a king, the limits of his powers, and the conflict between the will of the individual and the duty he owes to his state. Shakespeare himself will write a tragic drama centered upon the unhappy consequences of the division of a kingdom. He'll call it King Lear. Now, in 1588, we have a hugely popular hit in the form of two plays, Tamburlaine and its sequel, Tamburlaine Part 2, by Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe, who is an exact contemporary of Shakespeare's, was a brilliant, unorthodox, highly gifted writer who came to an untimely end in a tavern brawl at the age of 30. In the interim, he had almost certainly been employed as a spy by Queen Elizabeth's ministers, and historians have theorized that his ostensibly accidental death may actually have been a political assassination. Marlowe, in fact, was already in trouble at the time of his death for his tendency to make rash public statements. Marlowe's Tamburlaine presents the rise to power of a hero of humble origin, a shepherd who ends up conquering most of Asia Minor. His campaigns are carried out with great brutality, and the blood and guts are not banished off stage. The play is full of spectacle, climaxing when Tamburlaine enters in triumph in a chariot pulled by the kings he has conquered and whipping them on, calling them pampered jades of Asia. Tamburlaine takes his destiny in his own hands, claims a godlike power to enforce his will upon the world. He says, "I hold the fates bound fast in iron chains, and with my hand turn fortune's wheel about." Although the limits of his will become clear at the end of Tamburlaine Part 2, when he faces his own mortality, the plays give more room to his rise than his fall. They thus challenge to some extent the medieval notion of tragedy as being largely focused upon the fall of people from high places. Nor is it Tamburlaine's pride which destroys or limits him at the end, so much as the simple fact that he is mortal, subject to time, that he is not immune to death. In a later play, Dr. Faustus of 1592, Marlowe again shows us a low-born individual setting up his will against all norms and hierarchies, a man who wishes to fashion himself according to his own desires. Faustus challenges the Christian world order and God himself. Faustus is a scholar who is frustrated by the notions of any kind of limit, including the limits of his own humanity. He has excelled in all intellectual disciplines, yet art thou still but Faustus and a man. He laments and commits the ultimate transgression of selling his soul to Satan for superhuman powers and knowledge. But he can't escape the limits of his humanity. Indeed, in his final speech, spoken as the minutes tick relentlessly away from the last hour before the devil will claim him and he will be damned forever, he begs God to let him enter again a system of limitations. Impose some end on my incessant pain. Let Faustus live in hell 1,000 years, 100,000, and at last be saved. After Faustus has been torn to pieces by devils, the play's chorus offers us a more conventional moral which points to the errors of human overreaching, the destructiveness of humanity transgressing its proper limits. Faustus is gone, regard his hellish fall, whose fiendful fortune may exhort the wise only to wonder at unlawful things. But this concluding reassertion of orthodox morality remains in tension with the more powerful and evocative language of aspiring and suffering Faustus. In the last hour of his life, for example, as he waits for the devil to come and drag him to hell, Faustus's agony is articulated in astonishing poetry. Even before he is literally in hell, his language offers us proof that hell is a state of mind, and it might be that because of the resonance of his speeches, Marlowe's protagonist triumphs poetically, if not morally. The kind of challenge his desires offer to the status quo aren't completely diffused or recontained by the final moralizing commentary of the chorus. In both Tamburlaine and Dr. Faustus, a significant amount of the heroic action lies in the hero's language. Marlowe is often singled out for showing just what can be done with the blank verse line. Indeed, Marlowe's brilliant manipulation of the flexible rhythms of iambic pentameter, far more coruscating than the drab verse of Gorboduc, sets a fashion that prevailed for the next 50 years among English playwrights. Shakespeare would build upon Marlowe's experiments in blank verse. Marlowe's blank verse captures the flexible rhythms of ordinary speech, even as it gives it a formal ordering that exploits the poetic possibilities of language. Another popular and influential play of the late 16th century was the Spanish tragedy by Thomas Kyd in 1587. It starts a fashion for what we call revenge tragedies. plays which show individuals trying to enforce justice by their own actions in a world whose public and political institutions are corrupt. The hero is Hieronimo, whose son is assassinated by some high-born villains. After plunging into madness, he emerges from it to devise a plan in which, under cover of presenting a theatrical entertainment, he will turn mock deaths into real ones and kill off his enemies. When this succeeds and the stage is littered with corpses, he bites off his tongue so he can't be interrogated. Every act of violence, including the tongue chewing off, takes place on stage, in contrast to Gorboduc and also to the tragedies of classical antiquity, where death and destruction were always reported by messengers. Hieronymo's one-man campaign against evil takes down most of the good characters as well. Everyone is infected by the corruption of the court. A character desperate for revenge and on the verge of madness uses theatre for his own purposes and brings a train of destruction in his wake. Does this remind you of anything? It has often been suggested that kids' play influenced Shakespeare's composition of Hamlet. I've tried to suggest some of the concerns, some of the master plots for tragedy already popular by the time Shakespeare writes Hamlet. We should also note the actual historical context in which Shakespeare writes his tragedies. Elizabeth I of England died in 1603. All the major tragedies except Hamlet appeared after her death. Elizabeth had never married. She had wanted her own independence and that of her country, had cleverly insisted she was married to England alone, and she was succeeded by James I, her second cousin, who was already James VI of Scotland and would rule as James I of England from 1603 to 1625. So, we've moved from the Elizabethan world to what historians call the Jacobean period, just as Shakespeare himself turns from the comedies and histories of his early career to writing his chief tragedies. Jacobean is a word that is simply derived from the Latin word for James, Jacobus. Both Shakespearean and non-Shakespearean Jacobean tragedy is very dark indeed, preoccupied with the notion of corruption in high places and the destructive effects of power. Shakespeare's major tragedies are set in spaces that are geographically distant or are in the far-off past, whether they are in contemporary Venice or Cyprus or pre-Christian Britain or in 11th century Scotland or ancient Rome. But wherever and whenever they unfold, they may well gesture towards contemporary British preoccupations and anxieties. To some extent, the plays of this time seem to reflect the changes in England between two reigns. Elizabeth I was a successful and popular monarch, although her reign was darkened at the end when the unmarried and childless queen neared her death and refused until the very last moment to designate her successor, which created a good deal of anxiety and fear that her demise would be followed by a political crisis. It may not be coincidental that Hamlet, written at the very end of her reign, is very much concerned with the issue of inheritance, of succession, and with the passing on of the kingdom. James I was not a popular king, and his reign saw a series of clashes between the monarch and the parliament, which would eventually climax a generation after his death in the English Civil War. The new king was much less skilled in manipulating the nobles and parliament than Elizabeth had been. He insisted on the absolute power of the monarch, the divine right of kings, while being less than sensitive to the moral obligations of kings. His court was significantly more corrupt than Elizabeth's, and he conspicuously promoted the interest of his own favorite courtiers. He sold off public offices and sold off trade monopolies. He even sold off knighthoods quite blatantly. Meanwhile, England was suffering from galloping inflation, and while education was spreading to the middle classes, there was little sense of a meritocracy where the educated offsprings of non-noble families could get a foothold in public life or could get public office. There was a lot of unrewarded ability around, a lot of educated discontent. The expansions of the Renaissance, the broader circulation of learning, the expanded geography disclosed by the voyages of discovery, even new possibilities for high living and refined existence, all these only threw into clearer light the limits of the aristocratic political system as well as other metaphysical limits. This is still a world of easy death, death. Many women die young from childbirth and many other people die young from disease. Plague epidemics I've already mentioned are regular. The medieval notion that this life is merely the gateway to the higher reality of the afterlife had been attenuated by a new secularism, a new interest in individual human action in the here and now. But if this life was all there might be, then its limitations and uncertainties were for many able men all the more dispiriting. Which brings us back to the notion of tragedy as a mode in which the problem of evil and injustice and the mysteries of the human condition in general could be re-examined, where one might try to find significance in suffering and put it in some larger pattern. At the same time, the writer of tragic drama might not only raise questions about how to make sense of the sufferings of the individual in spiritual or metaphysical terms, he might also ask questions about what we should make of the man-made forces and structures which promote people's inhumanity to one another. Renaissance tragedy shows a good deal of interest in the inadequacy of human institutions to enforce justice. Some of these plays hammer away at the manner in which public structures seem to come into conflict with the desires or happiness of the individual. They explore the hypocrisies which blind whole societies to the discrepancies between the ways they profess to live and their actual actions. To put it in another way, the metaphysical questions tragedy takes up, such as what is the morality of individual revenge, have an interesting tendency to turn into political questions. If a society's laws forbid murder, if a society's religion insists that vengeance belongs to God and not to men, and that thou shalt not kill, what are the forces at work within such a society that could bring someone to feel that acting outside the law and ignoring the structures of religious belief is not only a moral obligation but the only possible course of action? Which brings us of course to Hamlet. But a word before we start actually exploring this play. I'm hoping that you will read the play yourselves. I would like you to start your readings by trying to clear your head of all preconceptions you may have about Hamlet. Read afresh if you've already read it before. Rediscover it. Hamlet is infinitely susceptible to rereading. I will be much more interested in laying out its complexities, raising lots of questions about it, and leaving space for you to ponder it further. And now onward to Hamlet.